It's an honour to get to introduce Dr. Siobhan McAlister, who's going to talk to us about the ceasefire generation, conflict, legacy, continuity and change. So when I woke up at 3 a.m. this morning, I decided to go for an early morning walk with my headphones on, listening to YouTube, and the algorithm was doing its work. And I'm very excited about this traditional Irish music coming up because I like to listen to that stuff, that kind of Celtic punk rock as well. And the algorithm decided to put on a song by a band called the Wolf Tones while I was walking around town. But some of the young people in the room won't know what this is. But I was like, oh, I think this place has changed a lot in the last 25 years since the Good Friday Agreement. But, you know, we're stopping the clock now. I was stopping that song as quickly as I could. I was walking around the streets of Belfast. But I'm so interested to hear about the way a new generation has grown in times of change here in Belfast. And who better to tell us about this than Siobhan McAlister, who, as well as having many important roles, most importantly probably for the person who pays the bills, is as a senior lecturer in criminology at Queen's University Belfast up the road. But most important role from my point of view is one of the editors in this team of editors at the Journal of Youth Studies. So now I'll pass over to you, Siobhan, and we look forward to hearing your opening keynote.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Good morning, everybody, and thanks to Dan for the introduction, and thanks to the organising committee for the invitation to present today. While my initial nerves might not show it, I'm actually delighted to be opening the Journal of Youth Studies conference in my own home city here in Belfast. As Cathy said, and many of you will be aware, Northern Ireland celebrated the 25-year anniversary of the Good Friday Peace Agreement just last year. And this was the political settlement that is said to have brought an end to 30 years of violence, often referred to as the Troubles. Interestingly, as Cathy also talked about, key actors in the peace process and figures in supporting peace descended on Belfast to celebrate the anniversary. The international media reported widely on the success of the agreement, how it had achieved peace and prosperity for Northern Ireland, and to reflect on what this meant for a generation of young people born after the ceasefires and peace agreement. Those that have variably been described as the ceasefire generation, ceasefire babies, the peace generation, the agreement generation. But 25 years after the peace agreement means that actually most young people who live in Northern Ireland now have actually experienced very little, if any, of the Troubles. And while Northern Ireland is characterised by anniversaries in what Cheryl Lawther describes as a post-conflict jurisdiction haunted by a conflict calendar in which every day is an anniversary, actually the anniversary of 25 years post-conflict is a useful time to stop the clock. I wonder how many times we're going to get stop the clock in to the conference. But it's a useful time to pause and to reflect and to think about where we are with regards to conflict legacy and its impacts on the current generation of young people in Northern Ireland. And that really is the aim of my paper today. Over the past 2 decades, I've had the fortune of working with some great people, and a number of them are here today, researching the experiences of young people in Northern Ireland, young people that would fall into that category of the agreement or ceasefire generation. And while some of that research has focused specifically on conflict legacy, so thinking about how the past might still play out in the present, actually, even when the research hasn't focused specifically on conflict, when it's been around young people's experiences of youth justice or care or violence against girls or children's rights, these legacy issues have always emerged. So for me, this really highlights one of the main concerns within youth studies, which is continuities at the time of change. In the 2020 special edition of the Journal of Youth Studies, which marked the legacy of the work of Andy Furlong, as Rob just said, Woodman, Childrick and MacDonald noted a key contribution of Andy's work was to stress the importance of keeping analytical attention on continuities as well as changes in the experiences of young people across time. So linking the experiences of the current generation to the experiences of earlier ones. And this, I think, is particularly vital in a post-conflict environment where a discourse of change and generational change is often propagated and where youth become used figuratively within that discourse. On his visit to Northern Ireland in 2013, we get many American presidents visiting. This was the 15-year anniversary of the Good Friday Peace Agreement. The then US President Barack Obama spoke to a packed hall full of young people in which he really invoked this notion of generational change. Young people throughout his speech were presented as a new generation, a generation of hope, and in his words, a generation who were free from the shackles of the past, so disconnected from the past, who were now living in a thoroughly modern Northern Ireland. He continued that young people of Northern Ireland should remind us of hope again, again and again, that despite resistance, setbacks and despite hardship, despite tragedy, you need to remind us of the future. But at the same time as symbolising hope, the figure of the ceasefire generation has also been invoked, unsurprisingly, as a symbol of risk, a warning of everything that was wrong with the past and which can jeopardise progress. So unsurprisingly, these two discourses, one of hope and one of threat for the future. And of course, we know these figures of youth, these simplified constructions that reflect well-rehearsed stereotypes, are not new, but they are powerful in their effect. Stephen Threadgold demonstrates how politicians can create versions of young people as rhetorical devices to obscure social and economic problems. We see this very much within some of the media discourse. But also importantly, Sarah Ahmed talks about how hope can also be used to distract people from the violence of the present. So there's dangers with these simplistic essentialist labels, with their false binaries of generation hope and generation hate. We know they can be used to generalise progress, they can mask inequalities, but they can also problematise and responsibilise those who do not live up to the hopes and the promises of the generation who've never had it so good. So what I think is it's because of the discursive power of these very labels that we actually have a responsibility as youth sociologists and as academics to really critically engage with them. But also, even within these quite simplistic labels, there are important sociological questions and issues to explore. Young people in Northern Ireland have experienced major social and political change, meaning that their lives are, or at least should be, very different to the previous generation. So instead of dispensing with the notion of generations, what I'm doing in this paper is I'm using a social generations approach as a lens through which to think about, situate and illustrate the realities of young people's generational experiences in Northern Ireland. And I hope in summing this up quickly that I'm not oversimplifying a social generations approach, but I want to outline why I think it's particularly useful in this context. And Dan will take all the hard questions around social generation theory. Dan notes that a social generations approach is a way to conceptualise the impact of social change on young people's lives. So it's a way really of understanding and locating young people's lives, outlooks, experiences within the context of historical and social change. It enables consideration of how very specific but shared generational processes, what Mannheim calls a generational location, shape young people's lives, but also how young people can shape their generational experience as well. So when there's big, major social, economic, institutional, political changes that are shared among a particular group, how do those shape the experiences and the outlooks of that group, and particularly in ways that might be different to the past generation. So we would expect then, if the generational location, the experiences of the current generation are very different from the past, that this might also produce new outlooks and new attitudes. Some people refer to this as a distinct consciousness. I have a question mark here, not everybody would agree with this, but we might assume that if there's changes in experiences and context, that might then also change our outlook on things. I think importantly to say here is that this doesn't assume a break with the past. It's an approach which enables us to examine connections and disconnections with the past, a continuity in the context of change. And it's also important to note that a social generations approach does not suggest that there's a shared generational experience or response to change, that there's these homogenous groups that are all affected in the same way. Again, inherent in Mannheim's original work on social generations was the recognition of social difference through his concept of generational units, which did recognise that experiences intersect and are affected by the determining contexts of class, gender, race, place, for example. And for me, this is actually very key to my analysis because my research doesn't focus on broad generational changes. It actually focuses on a particular generational unit, which I'll say a little bit more about shortly. So I suppose I should say that I'm aware there are a number of criticisms of the social generation approach, namely that it can conceal patterns of inequality across generations, but also within generations. But I actually think if it's used very deliberately as a tool in which to focus in on continuity and change within and across generations, that this actually can respond to some of that criticism. So again, I feel it's particularly useful in the context of Northern Ireland for some key reasons. Firstly is the significance of time and place. A generations approach really allows us to focus in on the micro, the local, the granular, how the conditions of a given time and place enable or constrain young people's opportunities, outlooks and experiences. Secondly, it recognises agency as well as structure. How do these changes within social life impact and shape young people's lives, but also how do young people respond to them? How do they work within them? And thirdly, and I think most importantly for me, is the centrality of the past within a social generations approach, a focus on intergenerational relations, on generational continuity and change, which really centres connections and disconnections between the past, the present and the future. And Charlotte McPherson has recently pointed to the tendency within youth studies to look towards the future, transitions from youth to adulthood, how changing social conditions shape future outlooks. But actually she calls on us to deliberately and intentionally rethink about how the past impacts the present and the future. And I think that's really how I'm using the approach today. Okay. So what do we mean by a shared generational location? Then what do we mean by this idea that young people today are connected by particular experiences which might be different to the previous generation? In the context of Northern Ireland, I think some of the major changes that have impacted young people's lives really emanate from the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. So this is the agreement of 1998, so fairly recent, just 25 years old. So we are just talking about one generation of potential change here. So the key ways in which this impacts on this generation of young people born around this time or growing up at this time was that there has been a dramatic decline in violence. We've seen the demilitarisation, really, of everyday life in the process of British troops being removed from the streets, paramilitary ceasefires, so cessation of what would have been bombings and shootings and regular everyday violence. We've also seen hugely a devolved power-sharing government. So we've moved from a position, or we've moved to a position of political compromise on the status of Northern Ireland. So a move away from violent fighting about the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, should it be under British rule or should it be under Irish rule, to accept that we will have a power-sharing government for Northern Ireland, which will, allegedly, represent the two communities, the Unionist Protestant community and the Catholic Nationalist community. We all know there's more than two communities in every society, but Northern Ireland and the way that our politics runs is based on this two community kind of setup. Also related to this is around identity. So citizens have freedom to choose their identity. You can have an Irish passport, a British passport, or both. Because of inequalities and human rights abuses in the past, we've seen real huge change to our social institutions, but particularly our criminal justice institutions and the police. We've seen investment, which you'll notice particularly around Belfast and the city centre. We've seen what we call the re-imaging of public space, whereby what would have been quite militaristic murals maybe being changed to celebrate community and culture in different ways. And all of this has led to many other changes, increased immigration and lots of other social changes. So my question then, or what I'm thinking about, is how do young people experience these social changes? And more specifically, how do they play out in the lives of what might be defined as a particular generational unit? Young people living in what typically would be working class communities that were most impacted by the conflict. So those communities which would have experienced high levels of death, injury, bereavement, disinvestment and disruption to everyday life. So as I say, not these broad generational patterns, but getting in under some of those notions of linear, huge change to think about, okay, within a particular generational unit, what does continuity and change look like? And I want to do this in three areas. In particular, what I want to think about is continuity and change linked to how young people use divided space, how they cross divided space. So their mobility patterns and their integration, their desire or willingness to integrate with the other community. Also, their political identity and culture and violence and safety. And the reason why I'm looking at these three areas in particular is they're core elements or principles of the Good Friday Agreement: shared space, respect for culture and identity, and a cessation of violence. So if there is such a thing as an agreement generation, well then we would expect to see changes in attitudes, orientations and experiences here. In 2019, Mary-Louise Corr and myself were commissioned to examine the transgenerational legacies of the conflict. And we did this through adopting what we call a cross-generational approach, whereby we carried out interviews with young people, so the so-called peace generation, aged 14 to 25. And we also carried out interviews with the parent generation, which may be seen as the war or the conflict generation. When I talk about the parent generation, I sometimes forget that I'm talking about my generation. This is those, you know, whose youths really had a backdrop of the conflict. I had a picture of Derry Girls here, but I removed it if anybody has seen Derry Girls. It was a life of young people who grew up and appeared to live a normal life, but in the background of all was all of this violence. They are the conflict or the war generation, those who are now in their 40s, 50s, 60s. They're the parents and the grandparents of young people today. And the first thing I wanted to do as I looked at some of this research through a generational lens was to first of all think about how young people and adults talk about generations. Because generations as conceived by Mannheim are about more than experiencing the same location. He suggests that they're also identified by the development of a distinct consciousness influenced by that context. that generations is a particular kind of identity of location. And what we seen then was that through young people's discussions, it became very clear that they did actually very much conceive of themselves and their peers as very different to the previous generation. So they might not have used the words, I'm a ceasefire generation or a ceasefire baby or the agreement generation, but they very much distinguished the attitudes, outlooks and experiences of their generation from their parent and grandparents' generation. So within their accounts, there was this real subjective sense of difference and of generational change. Not only did they experience less violence, more freedom, more safety, but their attitudes and outlooks were very much positioned around progress and very much then positioned in line with the core principles of the Good Friday Agreement. Both adults and young people that we spoke with today noted that young people are more willing to integrate, they have fewer fears and hostilities, fewer prejudices, are less likely to orientate to violence, and that if anyone was holding back change and clinging to the past, that it was adults, it was not the youth generation. But what was really interesting as well, and this has been found in Kim Allen's work as well, is that when young people were trying to make sense of what would be seen as more negative attitudes or views that they felt the previous generation held, they didn't tend to apportion blame. They very much located these within the context of the life experiences of adults. So in discussing the prejudices and the fears and even this sense among some young people that adults couldn't understand or look past their own problems and pains to understand young people's, they very much contextualised this within their conflict-related experiences. It was how they were brought up. It was what they lived through. So despite the view that was actually sometimes expressed by the adult generation, that young people today don't care about the conflict, they don't understand the troubles, they don't understand about its impact, this actually really was not the case among the young people that we spoke to. In fact, it was actually their understanding of the past that enabled generational comparison and this sense of generational difference. The reality is that the past is very present in the lives of the so-called ceasefire or agreement generation. And this is particularly the case for the young people growing up in the communities in which we carried out our research. The past is memorialised in murals, in commemoratives, in storytelling. It manifests in the pains of long-term and delayed trauma, poor mental health, drug and alcohol use. And all of this is recognised and understood by young people because it's actually lived by them. It's lived by them within their communities and within their families. And some of the drawings here are from our Young People's Research Advisory Group, who took what they felt were the key messages from the research and made some illustrations for the young people's version of our report. This knowledge of the past, this kind of symbol of the conflict generation, was also often invoked by young people to make sense of their own conflict legacy experiences. So they used generational comparisons not really to praise themselves or exalt themselves as being more tolerant, less violent, although they definitely felt they were, but they actually more often used it to diminish their own experiences of conflict legacy, particularly violence. So in this research and other research that I've been involved in within communities where there's still a pervasive presence of paramilitary and armed groups, what we would often find that is after discussing the violence that they've experienced, young people would end their account by saying something like, but it's not as bad as our parents had it. And this is really well exemplified in this quote by a young man who really struggled to explain how bad his own community was and how violent it was, because it wasn't as bad. So he kept talking about, he used the language of mad. Well, it's mad, but it's not as mad because it was more mad in the past. And for me, what this really exemplifies is that when we analyse generational talk, is that assertions and subjectivities and senses of difference can actually obscure continuities. And I think sometimes that it's the real value of qualitative research when we look at how we feel, how we sense things, how we talk about them, but then set that alongside young people's experiences. It actually shows a much more complex picture. And I wanted to show some of that complexity now. I'm just looking, I don't have a time. Good, okay. Okay, so the first thing I want to look here, as I say, is around mobilities and integration. Okay. So I think the first thing to note here is that, you know, similar to what surveys which show the likes of the Young Life and Times survey, which we use a lot here to track continuity and change and attitudes, is that there's little disputing the fact that young people have a greater desire and orientation towards integration and shared space than the previous generation. They're much more willing to integrate across space. They would like to be in mixed schools, and they're much more willing to be in mixed relationships. In such a way, really, that is very different to the past, because this wouldn't have been thought about by the previous generation, because it wouldn't have been possible for the previous generation. So we do see a disconnect there. But despite young people's orientations towards integration, what I want to show here is how their experiences are frustrated by the structural and cultural barriers rooted in the past. These barriers continue to shape and constrain, in particular, what we would call their everyday mobility practices. Now, I know that many in the audience will have some understanding of the divisions still within Northern Ireland, but for an international audience who might only see Belfast, actually you won't see many of these divisions. So as a reminder, over 90% of school-aged children are educated in segregated environments. By that I mean schools where the majority of the population within the school will be of the same religion or ethno-national group as them, so 90%. So only about 9% of post-primary school children attend integrated schools. And that hasn't changed much in the past 25 years. Added to this, many residential areas and in fact whole districts, whole electoral wards remained single identity areas where around 80% of the population identify as belonging to one of the main religious or ethno-national groups. And then we have what we call these defensive structures, locally referred to as peace walls, which continue to physically separate some communities, some neighbouring communities, some neighbouring Catholic nationalist communities and Protestant Catholic nationalist and Protestant unionist communities. These really enacted during the conflict as a means of regulating violence between the communities, but actually more of these structures were built after the peace agreements. And I think we reckon there's still around 60 of them across Northern Ireland. So look, when I'm saying this, I'm not suggesting there hasn't been progress and change, but I think it's a reminder of the nature and normalisation of division and how it's actually a backdrop to everyday life, but particularly for those who live in the types of communities where I've been carrying out my research. And I think this explanation by one young man really demonstrates this notion of continuities at times of change, how old divisions play themselves out in new ways in changing contexts. So there's a process of shared housing, shared social housing, so deliberately building spaces which will bring communities together. And he talked about how near him, actually, the community was mixed but demarcated. So we have this mixed housing estate, but these flags were put up at the corner of it, which then identify it as belonging to one or other of the communities. And young people, even when these visible markers are there, are actually acutely aware of the divisions within their communities, even if they're not visibly marked. So again, this is a young woman who says it's not as on the surface as it used to be during the conflict, so there might not be as many of these visible markers, but it's still very much deep segregation. So similar to previous generations, it's really still important that the current generation learn the symbolic meaning of space. They learn how to read space in order to judge places of safety or risk, places of inclusion or exclusion, belonging to one community or the other. And they do this through understanding this marking of space. It's identified through conflict imagery, through flags, through murals, through commemoratives, but also through language. You will notice street signs as well. These all are visible markers to read places as places of belonging or places of exclusion. But even when the places aren't marked, reputation and history of place is passed down in families and communities, which serve to inform, influence and constrain young people's mobility and their interactions with the other community. So what we see in our research is that young people draw on generational learning to cautiously move across space. So when they're deliberately crossing the boundaries that may be risky, young people continue to put a number of safeguards in place, these safety management strategies that they've learned within their communities and their families. They pay attention to the way they dress, again, very well illustrated by a young woman in our research. She's illustrating uniforms because if schools are so divided, your uniform tells you which community you belong to, and the flags within the community tell you whether you belong there or not. So young people pay attention to where they dress, their school uniforms, their sports clubs, but also the way they speak, who they're with, and the times of year when they will or will not cross boundaries. But I think what's really important here is that this reading alone of strategies that young people actively employ to negotiate divided space actually conceals the much more routinized and unconscious nature of many mobility patterns. That's those that are rehearsed and repeated habits and patterns of families and peer groups, the route that you take into the city centre, the park that you attend, the leisure centre you attend, the shops that you attend, because those are the ones that your families have always used. So these practices aren't actually often discussed by young people because they're not actually recognised. And for me, this brings us back to that point about narratives of integration. When we look at surveys, for example, or subjective feelings, young people may feel that they actually integrate a lot more, but actually a lot of these unconscious practices are so normalised, they're not even noticed. So what we see among this generation is how structures and cultures associated with the past continue to shape and constrain their mobility choices and their spatial practices. And what this does, consciously or unconsciously, is it both maintains and it reproduces segregation. But at the same time as these practices reproduce segregation and patterns of segregation, there's also real evidence within our research that young people resist these when it's safe to do so. Many were much more willing to interact with the other community than their previous generation, and actually very interestingly, much more willing to interact in comparison to research that I carried out with Phil Scraton and Dina Hayden 10 years before this. So we are seeing change within a generational group as well. Integration and crossing boundaries was often done against the advice of parents in direct resistance to the older generation, and we could see these as acts of subversion. They could be seen to actually disrupt adult fears and challenge their prejudices. In this respect, young people could be seen as actively agitating long-standing cultures and divisions and potentially reshaping the present and future possibilities. And this brings us back to the notion of social generations, shaped by but also shaping. So what we would say here then is that over 2 decades after the peace agreement, while the current generation appear to have more opportunities and perceive less risk of interacting and engaging, there are limitations still on their choices and freedoms, which are shaped by the material conditions. Living in single identity areas, attending single identity schools, and repeating these often unconscious spatial practices limit opportunities for integration despite the orientation or the desire for there to be more integration. Some of these quotations from our research, I think, show this real notion as well of progress, but it only goes so far. These are quotations from a young woman who has a boyfriend from the other community, quite happy to have a boyfriend from the other community, but still doesn't feel safe going to his community to see him and has to think about what she wears. Likewise, a parent talks about her son having a girlfriend from the other side of the line, from the other side of the peace wall. And again, that's okay for the relationship, but she doesn't want him going to that area because it's unsafe. So we see continuity and change kind of clashing against each other. And the other area we're thinking about is in terms of the Good Friday Agreement, as well as this notion of a shared society, of respect for culture and identity. 25 years after the agreement, is there any evidence that the post-conflict generation, that their political identities and attitudes are changed by the changed structures within Northern Ireland? I know identity is complex. I was about to say identity is complex in Northern Ireland, but identity is complex everywhere. And I'm not suggesting that ethno-national identity or religious identity is the only identity of young people, or actually really even the most important to them. But because ethno-national identity is kind of at the heart of the conflict, whereby violence and division have been based on oppositional identities, if we're looking at continuity and change, we really need to look at it. And this is where survey research has been particularly useful. Colin Coulter, drawing on a range of survey research, has identified a stark generational divide in attitudes and political identities. What they actually find is that the majority of young people in Northern Ireland today fall into the neither category. If they're asked, do they identify as nationalist or unionist, said to be the main political traditions in Northern Ireland, the majority of them tick the neither box. So again, this would give the sense that they are a generation being shaped by the Good Friday Agreement. But our qualitative research, as you would imagine, shows much more nuance. It does particularly show that culture and identity do remain very strong and important for young people, particularly in those communities where they were always strong. And that some of them do very much stick to expressions. They take pride in their culture and identity. But I think what is different is that this doesn't necessarily manifest in sectarianism. You know, to take pride in my identity doesn't mean I have a dislike for or a rejection of your identity. Indeed, young people identified such attitudes as belonging to the older generation. And what we actually seen was many examples of what Brewer would refer to as everyday life peace building, whereby young people would engage in these behaviours that would actually question, push back, and try to change the adults, the older generation's perspectives as well. There's learning here, I think, for some peace programmes in Northern Ireland, which often focus on changing young people, when actually what we can see here is it goes the other way around. Young people can actually teach the older generation more tolerance or impose new lifestyles and tastes. And again, it's the value of a social generations approach, because it does recognise that change isn't just unidirectional. But what we also find is that the agreement generation remain affected by this kind of persistent banal sectarianism, which does impact their outlooks and their experiences, and can at times really kind of elevate those oppositional identities. Family and community remain the main ways in which young people learn about culture and identity. But also, very importantly, I think in Northern Ireland is politics. So we have a very divisive political system. It was set up as a way to try and ensure that the rights of both communities were met. But what has actually ended up happening is it's hugely divisive and hostile and quite violent. It's resulted in frequent fallouts and breakdowns, always over issues about the past, legacy issues, victims, recognition of culture and expressions of identity. In fact, if we think to the 25-year anniversary of the peace agreement, where everybody descended on Belfast actually to celebrate, the Northern Ireland Assembly wasn't sitting at that time. It was one of its 6 periods of suspension. In fact, in the whole time that it's been set up from 1999, it's only been actually active for about a third of that time. So these are still the structures and cultures associated with the past which still impact on young people's outlooks and opportunities. And what we see is that these really, really come into force at particular times. And as I reflected on my research over the past 2 decades, I was really struck by the consistency of how ethno-national identity for young people in these communities is given particular meaning at particular time, how it becomes oppositional and hostile. In 2008, in research with Dina and Phil, there was concern within some of the Protestant communities that the Catholic communities were the ones that had benefited most from the peace dividend, and there was a great pushback there. 10 years later, when there was concerns because of Brexit that there might be the reinstatement of a hard border across the the island of Ireland, there was pushback from the nationalist community. And just last year, in research in the loyalist community, there's concerns about the sea border as a result of Brexit, because all of these things bring back that constitutional issue, the issues of the past, really, that the agreement never dealt with. And what we find then is that this really exalts the need to show culture and identity, that identity actually becomes much more important at times of insecurity, crisis, change, and threat. So again, we go back to this notion of continuity and change. Young people are navigating the complexities of the pools of the past at times when actually a lot of them do want change. There's just kind of real pull, there's real frustration in what they're able to do. And finally, violence. Again, we think what's been the main success of the Good Friday Agreement? People have said it's been the end of violence, the end of political violence. So in terms of young people's lives now, again, we might assume that we've seen an end to political violence. And of course, there can be little doubt that if we look at the quantitative indicators of violence and conflict, we have fewer bombings, we have fewer shootings, house raids, forced displacement, all of that. But actually, when you look into communities, what you find is that conflict-related violence, and particularly in the form of paramilitary or armed groups, didn't end with the ceasefires. It sounds odd to say that paramilitary groups which were about ceasefires didn't end with the ceasefires, but they've actually morphed and mutated under changing political circumstances, and they've very much morphed and mutated because of a lack of policy attention. If we look at the statistics, and we know the statistics are a complete underrepresentation here, but since the Good Friday Agreement, there's been over 3,000 recorded paramilitary-style attacks. We can't call them paramilitary attacks because paramilitaries are on ceasefire. So paramilitary-style attacks. So this is shootings and beatings, and a fifth of these were directed towards children under the age of 18. So despite this, and despite work of community workers in communities and researchers in these communities, it took until 2015, 17 years after the agreement, before there became a dedicated policy to actually respond to paramilitarism. So the denial and disregard of these issues in some of the most deprived communities affected by the conflict has actually facilitated the longevity of these groups. So again, here we see consistent connections with the past and intergenerational inequalities and experiences of violence. The violence that these communities experienced in the past, they're the same communities that experience the violence today. And I think across all of my projects at different points of time, in different communities, although still conflict-affected communities, this is where there's been most consistency. Countless examples of abuses against children and young people, intimidation and threat, financial extortion, exiling, shootings and beatings, criminal coercion, sexual exploitation. Of course, I'm not going to relay the details of the violence, but young people, parents and youth workers often lay bare the nature of violence that children and young people experience. Here are some examples just of the kind of the psychological and the social consequences of violence, the impact on young people's mental health, but also the impact on things like their education. And actually, we haven't even done any research on the long-term impacts of this for young people. It's actually become so normalised that it happens and we almost move on. I added to this, though, narrow definitions and official measures of paramilitary violence actually conceal the impacts of living in communities in which the possibility of violence is always present and known. In a paper with Gail Neal, in which we surfaced the particular experiences of young women, a group who are rarely considered in the post-conflict discourse, never mind in relation to this form of violence, we drew on Laura Scherberg's work on gendered and sensed experiences of war to try and look at the various ways in which young women were touched by violence. Seeing and witnessing violence, hearing about violence incidents. We talk about this notion of, well, of a paramilitary talk, the amount of talk in communities about who's being threatened, who's under threat at a particular time, the signs of violence, that feeling that coercive atmosphere in communities, and feeling their own pain and bearing the pain of others. We very much argue the need for a breakdown of hierarchies. We have a tendency to talk about, higher level harms or hierarchies of violence, but actually these narrow definitions of harm and violence conceal all the ways in which young people within communities are affected by violence in a post-conflict society. So violence associated with the conflict and with the past remains in lots of ways, and in ways in which the peace narrative that was rolled out at every anniversary of the agreement really does silence. Violence is part of the political and social landscape. It plays itself out in the workings of opposition politics, in culture wars, in the residual presence of paramilitary or armed groups, in the structural violence of poverty, lack of investment and opportunity, and in the high levels of mental ill health. So while there may well be a change in the nature of violence, there is continuity in its lineage. It's very much related to the past, and that all of these forms of violence continue to be experienced unequally. They're experienced most in those communities which had always experienced more violence. And illustrating the various forms of violence experienced by what's called the ceasefire generation, or ceasefire babies, journalist Lyra McKee wrote of her generation and how her generation, in her words, got fucked over in the peace accord. She said, "They call my generation the ceasefire babies, though I always hated that name. Politicians, hoping to sell the peace deal to our parents, made 3 promises. The first promise they barely delivered on, peace. It wasn't the peace promised, just an absence of all-out civil war. The second promise was prosperity. Peace where we were assured would bring a thriving new economy, but it never appeared. The third promise the politicians made and broke was the one that hurt the most. It was felt mostly in the areas that had already been ravaged, the ones where the gunmen continued to roam. Your children, they told our parents, will be safe now. With the peace deal, the days of young people dying young would be gone, yet this turned out to be a lie as well." In the final promise that Lyra's talking about there, she's talking about the high suicide rates and high levels of mental ill health among young people and the lack of investment. And she very much talks about how the peace dividend and the promises of peace have not been felt in communities like hers. Lyra McKee was shot dead by a dissident Republican paramilitary group in April 2019, so 2 decades after the peace agreement. She was caught in the crossfire as she was observing a riot which broke out after the police raided houses in advance of a commemorative event in Derry, Londonderry. And everything about that event tells us about the continuities of the past and how the past can just have these really, really terrible impacts in the present. And while these forms of conflict and forms of violence really do dominate politics and policies, other forms of violence which were perhaps facilitated and concealed by the conflict, domestic violence, violence against women and girls, hate crimes, have actually been given very little attention in Northern Ireland policy until their presence becomes so obvious that we have to do something about it. Now, when we look at these issues, actually, when we look at who is on the streets campaigning on these issues, it often is young people trying to raise awareness. But they're often undermined again by the political situation, which is so narrowly defined that it's not looking at these wider legacy issues. So I don't mean to end the presentation on a downer, but I did. But I guess the point is that Lyra's experience and James's, that he's writing his book in his graphic novel, The Ceasefire Babies, actually isn't hugely different from the young people in the communities in which we carry out our research. And I think this kind of critical and sociological and real granular analysis of the lived experiences of one segment of the so-called ceasefire generation really reveals to us the complex interplay of continuity and change. There's no denying that the experiences of young people today are different to the previous generation. Even within the group who were most affected, there's no denying that their experiences are different to their parents and grandparents. But we do see intergenerational inequalities here. This is the group who continue to be disproportionately impacted by the past, by violence, by divisions, by inequalities. So we do see intergenerational inequalities under these new conditions. So while young people do present these orientations and outlooks, which might be associated with the agreement, they're regularly frustrated and interrupted and reversed by structural and cultural influences of the past. Finally, again, to make the point that young people do push back. It's not to suggest that young people don't push back on these things, but it's to try and show how frustratingly slow change can be, and actually how complex change can be, and that can be concealed in peace narratives and in these kind of generationalisms of the ceasefire generation. But if we take a more sociological approach, we can actually reveal some of the nuances of people's lives within these contexts. That's me. Thanks, guys.